Welcome back to Rockers to Doctors. My name is Dorian Prescott.
And I'm Nova Starwick.
And today we'll be returning for part 2 of one of our wildest stories we've discussed. We're talking about a band that burned bright, burned fast, and then spent the rest of their careers proving they didn't burn out. Skid Row.
That's right. This is the story of one of the last great bands of the glam metal era, and one of the first to slam into the wall that was the 1990s.
If you recall from the first Skid Row podcast, we experimented with the script and delivered the story in first person, as if you are an original member of the band.
The conceit is you're a failed musician who happened upon a way to time travel. You decided to go back to the 1980s to start a band, but things didn't quite work out the way you'd envisioned.
By convenient accident, you ended up having to get a job at a ground round restaurant in New Jersey to make ends meet. But one night, you overheard a conversation at a table amongst a few long-haired guys who were trying to form a band.
You asserted yourself as a great musician, and the band decided to give you a try. Weeks later, you became the third guitarist in the band Skid Row.
Where we last left off, you joined Skid Row in the writing and recording of the second album, Slave to the Grind. It stands out against all the other hard rock and pop metal albums released that year in that it refused to cater to the softened, polite, radio-friendly sound that characterized the last generation of hair bands. Instead, you recorded an album as loud and chaotic as an air conditioner tumbling down a staircase. And now that the album is complete, it's time to get back on the road.
If you like what you hear today, leave us a comment. Come check us out at rockers2doctors.com as well. Now, let's get on the tour bus.
You were riding high off the success of Slave to the Grind. It had debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, the first heavy metal album ever to do that straight out of the gate, and your mailbox at your New Jersey apartment was full of royalty checks.
And the success continued, even though the world of rock had changed. Grunge was rewriting the rules of what rock was supposed to look and sound and feel like. Overnight, you'd watch some of your big hair contemporaries become relics. And even though Skid Row suddenly found themselves lumped in with a scene that was being actively buried, your band seemed to stay afloat.
This was in part due to manager Doc McGee's insistence on heavy touring. But here's where you come in. Months prior to getting on the bus, while you were all working on mastering the process of Slave to the Grind album, you pulled Doc and Rachel Bolan aside and said, if we want to stay relevant, we need to tour with this band that all the young kids are listening to, Nirvana.
Doc laughed you off. He believed that if this new kind of music coming from Seattle would actually take off, which he didn't believe, it wouldn't last. It would blow over, and then young people would return to metal. He insisted he'd seen phases come and go all throughout his professional career.
You had the Nirvana album with you, so you offered it to Doc. He turned you down, but Rachel grabbed the album and inspected it. He read the liner notes, and suddenly his face dropped. He handed the CD back to you and said, we're screwed.
Doc asked, why do you believe that?
Rachel pointed to the back of the CD case. He said, it was produced by Butch Vig and put out by Geffen. That's it. It's all over for us. Every kid in America is going to own this album.
You wanted to congratulate Rachel on his 100% accurate prophecy. He was right. This album was a death blow.
And that's why you insisted on Skid Row touring with Nirvana.
Doc actually took your advice and put in a word with the higher-ups, but ultimately, Nirvana turned Skid Row down, with Kurt Cobain citing the Sebastian Bach t-shirt controversy, which is when Bach was photographed wearing a t-shirt reading AIDS kills dead, which he claimed a fan threw on stage and he put on without reading. The backlash had been enormous and was still following the band.
Days later, you got that news that instead of Nirvana, Skid Row would be touring with Pantera, who everyone but you discovered when Scott Hill played Cowboys from Hell during a recording session break. Bach said, hearing that album, he immediately knew he wanted to help introduce Pantera to North America.
The day came. You were very excited to go on tour. You loved being a rock star, but you were also a little apprehensive. You knew that things could go wrong with the band at the drop of a guitar pick.
Things were fine at first. Pantera were downright cool. just as you assumed. You fought the urge to reveal that the band that they, would still be at the forefront of metal in the 2020s, but that might beg the question that would lead to the tragedy of Dimebag Darrell's passing. You avoided even inferring that you had knowledge of the future.
Soundgarden came on board for about 3 weeks while Pantera took a break. The contrast between Soundgarden's grunge ethos and Skid Row's glam metal insanity was extraordinary. Whenever Bach would ask Chris Cornell to come up and jam on Train Kept a Rollin' at the end of the night, Cornell would run around the stage doing figure eights and somersaults, clearly sending up the whole heavy metal performance tradition with a grin on his face.
Before the Slave to the Grind tour, Skid Row had been opening for Bon Jovi, the band that essentially launched their career, if you remember. And things had gotten very ugly. Bon Jovi's road crew had been pranking and tormenting Bach throughout the run, including one incident where three crew members grabbed him from behind before he was about to go on stage at Rupp Arena in Kentucky, held his arms, and poured an entire vat of freezing ice milk over his head. He ran on stage soaking wet and furious.
Bach's response was to say something derogatory about Bon Jovi from the stage. You were up on stage, but you weren't listening. By now, everyone in the band knew when to tune out Bach. According to reports, Bach had referred to Bon Jovi as Bon Blow Me. After the show, Bach came off stage and was confronted by what he described as 60 people, John Bon Jovi in the front, flanked by his father and brother, with the full Bon Jovi road crew behind him. John Bon Jovi said, "I heard what you said on stage, mother," and threw a punch. Bach ducked it. The crew grabbed him and threw him against a concrete wall. Bon Jovi's brother Tony screamed about the Bon Blow Me comment, and John's father reportedly pointed in Bach's face and said, "I'll kill you." John himself had earlier told Bach privately, "I'll own you."
John Bon Jovi's later account in a magazine cover story was simply, I punched the out of Sebastian, decked him on this fat little and I'll do it again. I knocked him out and I'll do it again. Bach disputed that version entirely, saying Bon Jovi threw a punch that he dodged and that it was Bon Jovi's crew who did most of the damage. Snake Sabo called it a misunderstanding.
I see. One interesting footnote. You'd heard that Skid Row's t-shirts were reportedly outselling Bon Jovi's merchandise on that tour. You've been around long enough to know that something as trivial as that could almost certainly be what set the drama in motion.
You'd think Bon Jovi would understand. When they were up and coming, they toured with Motley Crue as an opening act. Crue hadn't been informed that part of the tour's stage design featured the words Bon Jovi written across the front of the stage. Motley Crue having to play on that stage were pissed about the territorial dispute, and rightly so.
The tour culminated with an appearance at Monsters of Rock at Castle Donington in 1992, one of the biggest stages in rock. But by then, the cultural tide had officially and completely turned. Nirvana had exploded. Grunge was everywhere, and Skid Row, having made one of the heaviest and most forward-thinking albums of the glam metal era, found themselves caught between two worlds. Too heavy for the hair metal crowd, too rock star for the grunge crowd.
The Slave to the Grind tour was over a year of sustained intensity, controversy, behind the scenes chaos, and genuinely brilliant music. It was a massive run consisting of 169 shows in 16 countries. You toured with Soundgarden, Pantera, and with LA Guns in Europe. Incidentally, if you live in the Cincinnati area, LA Guns would be playing at the Blue Note in Harrison on Friday, May 29th. One of the three bands that night will be my 1980s and 90s metal hard rock cover band, Skull, doing a 30-minute set. This is my shameless self-promotion. I feel no shame for taking this opportunity to promote my outside interests.
Okay, so sadly, this was essentially the last time Skid Row was truly at the center of the rock universe. You knew that historically, it would all be downhill from here. Everything that came after, as great as some of it was, became enormously difficult to sustain. And Dorian's shameless plug was from the year 2026.
You are wealthy now, but absolutely tired. You were hoping to take a few months off. In fact, your prophetic knowledge had hit a wall by this point. As a teenager, you'd owned the first two Skid Row albums, but had lost interest after that. You now had no idea what would happen next in the Skid Row story other than a slow collapse.
And here's the thing that's important to understand: your manager, Doc McGee, actually told everyone to take an extended hiatus after the Slave to the Grind tour ended in early 1993. His advice was essentially wait for the grunge wave to pass, which to some of your bandmates sounded reasonable. But in hindsight, sitting out during a cultural shift like that can be deadly for a band's momentum.
Before you all went fully quiet, though, you put out something in late 1992 that actually tells you a lot about who Skid Row really were underneath all the rock star flash. It was an EP called B Side Ourselves. It was all covers, and the track listing is fascinating. You covered songs by Kiss, The Ramones, Judas Priest, Jimi Hendrix, and Rush. B-Sides Ourselves revealed just how wide Skid Row's musical DNA actually ran. And it went gold. People tend to forget that. They have paychecks to prove it.
The EP emerged from a genuinely democratic process within the band. Rather than one person deciding what to cover, each of you got to choose one song. Well, everyone but you. You'd made a second attempt to persuade the band to cover a song that didn't yet exist, The Black Parade by My Chemical Romance. They laughed in your face. Then you chose Bad Medicine by Bon Jovi, and that nearly got you kicked out of the band.
So, after the hiatus, in which grunge didn't fade away, you went back into the studio in 1994. And this is where the story gets complicated on multiple levels simultaneously. The first big change that the first big change was you parted ways with longtime Skid Row producer Michael Wagoner, who had helmed the first two albums. This time, Skid Row was bringing in a big name, one we all recognize, Bob Rock.
Now, Bob Rock in 1994 was arguably at the peak of his powers as a producer. He had just finished working with Metallica on the Black Album in 1991, which sold 30 million copies worldwide. He was the guy. On paper, this was a dream hire. I mean, you had no idea Skid Row had hooked up with Rock, and you were totally excited to work with this historic producer. But in practice,
In practice, the recording of the album Subhuman Race was a nightmare. Rachel Bolan has talked about this extensively in interviews over the years. He said Bob Rock's approach was completely different from what Skid Row was used to. With Wagoner, there was a collaborative energy. The band had input. There was this trust built over multiple records. With Rock, according to Bolan, it was very much, I quote, play it this way, do it that way. Very controlling.
and Bowen actually said, and I love this quote: I've got to be honest, I didn't know what Bob wanted. The only thing I have a feeling he wanted was not to be there.
Ouch. And on top of the producer friction, the label was pushing Skid Row to deliver a record before they were really ready. Subsequently, Bolan said point blank, that record was a nightmare. Internally, the band had fallen apart, but we were forced to go in and do another record. Those are his words, and those were also your experiences. The band was already fracturing before they even walked into the studio.
And sitting right at the center of those fractures was Sebastian Bach. The creative tensions that had been simmering for years were now starting to boil. You kept your head low. Bach had already beaten you up once, yet everyone knew that something needed to be done or the band would implode. During the hiatus, management had even attempted to mediate the band, and guess who they brought in to be the mediator?
Axl Rose?
Come on, Dorian, use your brain. That would never happen.
Uh, Kurt Cobain.
What's wrong with you? Kurt had passed away by this point. They brought in Dee Snider.
Dee Snider. Jeez, that's ironic, since as of now, Sebastian Bach is the new lead singer in Twisted Sister.
Dee Snider as a marriage counselor for Skid Row, I cannot get over that. Of all the people, and it didn't stick. Because by the time you were halfway through recording Subhuman Race, the relationship was deteriorating badly.
Bach himself has said that the creative disagreements were at the root of it. He later told interviewers he was sent new music by the band and he didn't think it was good enough, that he wanted songs like Youth Gone Wild and 18 in Life, not songs that were, in his words, just okay. And he told them that straight up.
When your vocalist tells the songwriters their new material isn't good enough, you don't come back from that easily. You were especially pissed because every so called original song you tried to bring into the rotation, like What's My Age Again, Down with the Sickness, and I Did It All for the Nookie, was flat out rejected.
Subhuman Race came out on March 28th, 1995, and musically, you found it to be a genuinely interesting record that deserved more credit than it got. It was your darkest, heaviest album by a significant margin. There's groove metal, thrash influence, even touches of alternative rock, all bleeding together. Songs like Bonehead was like a pleasurable kick in the nuts, even though that's an awkward simile. My Enemy opens with these grinding, downtuned riffs. That was your idea, but of course your bandmates took credit. The title track is furious. Bach's vocal performances are extraordinary throughout. He's singing harder than ever.
But the production is where it falls apart. And this is where it gets funny in a painful way. There is an entire internet thread dedicated to the series, the theory that Subhuman Race was the origin of Bob Rock's infamous snare drum sound that later appeared on Metallica's Saint Anger in 2003. People call it the tin can snare, and if you listen to those two records side by side, the argument is not crazy.
Bach himself has basically agreed. He said he literally cannot understand what Bob Rock and engineer Randy Staub were thinking with this production. And Bolan said simply, the record absolutely sucks, which is startlingly honest about your own album.
The album peaked at number 35 on the Billboard 200. Now, coming down from a number one debut on the previous record, that is a brutal drop. And while it got mixed to positive reviews, critically and commercially, it was a major disappointment. The cultural moment had moved on. Grunge was still king. Skid Row was fighting a war on multiple fronts. The outside world didn't want them, and the inside of the band was coming apart.
The Subhuman Race tour was tense. There were nights that you would wait in the hallway backstage for groupies to arrive, and you'd wait, and you'd wait. Eventually, it would grow quiet. The janitor would amble by with his mop and bucket, and he'd say, "Good show," and move on. Sometimes you'd be the last one there, and the lights would go out. No one wanted your autograph. I mean, no one ever wanted your autograph in particular, but the rest of the band found it took a hell of a lot longer to run out of ink on this tour.
You were playing smaller venues. When you turn on MTV, you'd wait and wait for your videos to come on, just like you waited and waited for groupies and autographs to sign. Sometimes it'd come on, but hardly enough to generate any interest whatsoever. The relationships within the band were reaching a breaking point. All roads led in one direction, to the incident that ended everything: the Kiss answering machine incident.
Hmm, interesting name. Do you know what incident ended everything for Guns N' Roses?
What incident didn't end everything for Guns N' Roses?
Well, that's true, but one particular incident.
The spaghetti incident?
Yes, good job. We're both college educated.
Whew.
The Kiss answering machine incident is one of the great rock and roll disaster stories. In 1996, Skid Row was offered an opening slot on the Kiss reunion tour, the one where Ace Frehley and Peter Criss came back, everyone in full makeup for the first time in years. Hold that thought. If you're interested in learning more about that reunion and the entire history of Kiss as well, check out our deep dive episodes on Kiss. We'll list the links in the notes below.
Obviously, this was a major deal. And the show in question was at the Meadowlands in New Jersey, which was essentially Skid Row's backyard. They would have a built in crowd.
And Sebastian Bach, being a lifelong Kiss fanatic, was absolutely thrilled. He booked it. Done. This is happening. You were the oddball in the group. It's not that you didn't like Kiss, you were just born a little after the fad, and they hadn't become the soundtrack to your childhood. The guys in Skid Row grew up listening to Kiss, and you'd grown up listening to, well, Skid Row. But it's not like you had any issue whatsoever opening up for Kiss.
There was one slight conflict of interest. Rachel had a side project called Prunella Scales, and they were a punk band he had put together with some of the members of their road crew. And apparently, Prunella Scales had a prior commitment that happened to coincide with the Kiss date. So Boland said no to the Kiss slot. The side project with the road crew took priority over opening for Kiss at the Meadowlands.
It's a bit difficult to unwind what actually happened here. Apparently, Snake Sabo hadn't wanted to open for Kiss either, with rumors suggesting that he felt Skid Row was too big to be matched with Kiss. Either way, Bach was furious, and understandably. So are you. You got so mad you punched a hole in the wall at the hotel. And what sucked about that was you weren't making enough money anymore to trash hotel rooms. The bill for this one ate heavily into your dwindling finances.
So Bach called Snake Sabo's phone number in a rage. Snake didn't pick up, but the answering machine did. And Sebastian proceeded to leave a message that, by all accounts, was scorching, angry, and profane. Sabo later recounted it as an abyss of hatred, the full range of his feelings delivered at full volume.
The problem being that it was around Christmas time and Snake had a room full of family and friends over when that message played.
So everyone heard it, every word. And that was the end. After 9 years, after all those albums, after all those miles, a voicemail is what snapped the thread. Snake waited for his family to leave that night, then called Bach and said calmly, "You know, I got your message. I'll never play in a band with you again."
Though I do want to note, 4 years later, when Sebastian was no longer the singer, they opened for the Kiss Farewell Tour.
Yep, I'm sure Bach had absolutely nothing to say about that.
So now it's 1996. Your band is without their singular frontman. The band you and your friends built your identity around, that voice, that presence, that personality, is gone. Not like you didn't know that, but it's altogether different when you experience it. You've had enough. You want out of 1996 so badly that you break your hand punching the walls in the hotel rooms. You've caused so much property damage that you're in debt and being sued by Comfort Inn.
Fortunately for you, there comes a day when you punch the wall so hard that you rip a hole in the fabric of space time, opening a portal to what you hope is home in 2026.
And that isn't it. In fact, you are now in an entirely different situation, one that we at Rockers to Doctors will return to soon. You happen to find yourself in 1983, sitting on a bar stool next to a guy named Mike, who just asked you to come and jam with his new band, LA Guns.
The remaining members of Skid Row notice you're missing 3 weeks later. Without you, however, they've spent a couple of years floating wherever the tide takes them. They actually toured for a period under a different name entirely, Ozone Monday. Their singer was named Sean McCabe, and they opened for Kiss and Motley Crue. In 1998, they released a best of compilation called 40 Seasons, the best of Skid Row, without any input from Bach.
Meanwhile, Bach was out there doing his own thing. This is when his story gets really fascinating. After the split, he briefly joined a band called The Last Hard Men, which featured Kelly Deal of the Breeders and Jimmy Chamberlain of the Smashing Pumpkins. That's a pretty wild lineup. They did a cover of Alice Cooper's "School's Out" for the Scream soundtrack in 1996. In 1999, Bach put out his first solo album, Bring 'Em Bach Alive, mostly live Skid Row songs, plus a handful of new studio tracks.
And then one of my favorite left turns in rock history, Sebastian Bach went to Broadway. In the year 2000, Sebastian Bach made his Broadway debut playing the lead roles in Jekyll and Hyde at the Plymouth Theater in New York. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the reviews were genuinely positive. Broadway insiders were shocked, rock fans were shocked, even Bach seemed a little shocked.
The producers at Atlantic Records, the same label that had released Skid Row's albums, tipped him off that the show was looking for a successor to Jack Wagner in the lead role. Bach auditioned and got it, and they actually raised the key of several songs by a full octave to showcase what his voice could do. He followed that with the Rocky Horror Show in Broadway in 2001, awesome, playing Riff Raff, and then a national touring production of Jesus Christ Superstar where he played Jesus, Sebastian Bach, playing Jesus on a national tour. Here's hoping that wasn't a bottle incident on the tour.
If you followed Bach, he continued putting out solo music over the years. Angel Down in 2007, Kicking and Screaming in 2011, Give 'Em Hell in 2014. He's been consistently busy and consistently putting out strong material. But Skid Row has always been the conversation that follows him everywhere.
Now, back to Skid Row. In 1999, they officially reformed with a new frontman. His name was Johnny Solinger, from a Texas based band called Solinger. And Johnny Solinger is a figure in this story who deserves to be treated with a little more respect than history has given him.
He was not Sebastian Bach. Nobody was going to be Sebastian Bach, but Solinger was a solid, gritty rock vocalist who kept this band alive for over 15 years. He ended up being the longest serving vocalist in Skid Row history. That is a fact that tends to get lost.
The first album with Solinger was Thick Skin in 2003, 8 full years after Subhuman Race. 8 years is an eternity in rock music. The album leaned into a more modern, post-grunge sound with chunky guitars, heavy grooves, and a raw aesthetic. Tracks like Ghost and New Generation got some radio play. It wasn't a smash, but it was a respectable comeback attempt.
One thing Thick Skin included that I find interesting, if not bold, they recorded I Remember You Too, a punk rock reimagining of their classic ballad, I Remember You. Some saw this as self aware and fun, others thought it was slightly tragic.
The follow up was Revolutions Per Minute in 2006, which actually brought back Michael Wagoner as a producer. They were trying to recapture some of the original alchemy. The reception was mixed. The band went quiet again for a long stretch as they worked on the trilogy of EPs under the United World Rebellion banner, 3 chapters released in 2013 and 2014. This could be seen as more evidence of the band not quite finding their footing in the post-Bach era.
And then, in April 2015, Solinger was out. After 16 years, the band fired him and brought in Tony Harnell, the legendary high note singer from Norwegian power metal band TNT. On paper, this made sense. Harnell had one of the most powerful voices in hard rock, but he was gone within 8 months. He and the band just couldn't make it work.
Then, in January 2017, former Dragon Force vocalist ZP Theart was officially named the new singer after spending a year as a touring member. Theart was technically proficient and a hard worker, but it didn't quite fit. And in March 2022, they parted ways with him too.
So by 2022, Skid Row had now gone through Sebastian Bach, Johnny Solinger, Tony Harnell, and ZP Theart. That's a lot of frontmen for one band, and each transition came with its own drama, its own adjustment period, and its own wave of fan skepticism.
And then came Erik Grönwall. And this is where the story actually gets hopeful for a moment.
So, Erik Grönwall is a Swedish singer, formerly of a band called Heat. And here's the full circle moment that you genuinely can't write. In 2009, Grönwall auditioned for Swedish Idol, and his audition song was 18 in Life by Skid Row.
He sang a Skid Row song on a Swedish TV singing competition, won the season, got famous, joined Heat, toured the world, and 13 years later became the lead singer of Skid Row.
The universe does have a sense of humor.
Skid Row had actually toured Europe with Heat, and that's where they got to know Grönwall. When ZP Theart was let go, Grönwall was at the top of the list, and reports from his live debut with the band are extraordinary. He met his new bandmates 4 days before he went on stage with them in Las Vegas, and fans said he commanded the set like he'd been doing it for years.
The album they made together, The Gang's All Here, was Skid Row's first studio record in 16 years. The response was genuinely exciting. Reviews called it the closest the band had come to the energy of Slave to the Grind since, well, Slave to the Grind. One reviewer said that Grönwall was the first vocalist they'd brought in who could actually handle Sebastian Bach's range. And that's not a small thing to say.
The album opens with Hell or High Water, which has been compared to Monkey Business from Slave to the Grind in terms of attitude. The title track even references Tricky Little Vicky from an old B-side called Rattlesnake Shake, a little Easter egg for the longtime fans. The production is sharp, punchy, everything the band needed. Snake and Scotty's guitars are firing, Bolan's bass is thunderous, and Grönwall rattles the windows and walls on every track.
Fans were thrilled the band was writing again. Snake mentioned in early 2023 that they had already had 4 potential songs for the next album. Everything was pointing up, and then March 2024 happened.
Erik Grönwall announced he was leaving the band. He had been diagnosed with acute lymphoballistic leukemia in March 2021, just 6 months before he joined Skid Row. He went through chemotherapy, a bone marrow transplant, and then immediately jumped into being the frontman of a hard touring heavy metal band. That's incredible and inspiring, and also, in retrospect, it clearly took a toll.
Touring the world with a compromised immune system from a bone marrow transplant is really dangerous. His body could not sustain the demands of life on the road. And he was honest about that. He said he loved being in Skid Row, loved waking up every day as the lead singer of Skid Row, but loved and respected his health more. He made the call that he had to.
Though it's worth noting that there is a slightly complicated aftermath here. Rachel Bolan and Snake Sabo did a podcast interview where they admitted there was something a little confusing about the timing because shortly after leaving for health reasons, Grönwall announced a book deal, an autobiography, and a European tour with Michael Schenker.
It's a complicated situation, and it sounds like it ended with more ambiguity than anyone would have liked. But in the meantime, Lizzie Hale from Hailstorm stepped in for a handful of shows in 2024 to help the band fulfill their commitments, which was a great moment since Hailstorm had covered Slave to the Grind years earlier, and she clearly had the chops for it.
And now we're here in 2026. As of this recording, Skid Row still does not have a permanent singer. Rachel Bolan has said they have a couple of guys on the radar. The whole band has to agree. It's not one person's decision. And the criteria are enormous. You have to be able to sing the songs, of course, carry the legacy, fit the personality of the band, and survive the scrutiny of a fan base that has been burned by this process multiple times.
And Sebastian Bach is still out there. The Wound from 1996 is 30 years old, and it doesn't seem to have healed at all. Whether that changes one day, who knows? But right now, 2 very different versions of Skid Row's legacy are living in parallel.
The band without Bach is still Snake and Rachel and Scotty, the people who wrote the songs. The legacy without the band is still that voice, still that history. It's a story with no clear ending.
Which might be exactly why we're still talking about it 35 years later. As of right now, Skid Row has come up with a novel way to find a new singer. They teamed up with the musical instrument and gear vendor Sweetwater to host open auditions in an online contest. Folks are asked to provide a video of themselves singing select Skid Row songs, and we fans can watch those audition videos online.
We've provided some of our verdicts on various audition videos in our online shorts. We also recently interviewed one of the artists who auditioned, Scott Smile. Check out the links in the description.
And unless you've been living on the moon or hiding in Mark Zuckerberg's bunker, you've probably heard that Sebastian Bach is now the new singer for Twisted Sister. We're all very excited to see how that turns out.
And that's Skid Row, everybody. What a ride it has been. And apparently, what a ride it still is.
If you like this episode, let us know. Check us out at rockers2doctors.com, as well as Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Instagram, Amazon Music, YouTube, TikTok, and Pandora.
Until then, stay loud, stay curious, headbanging with a hypothesis.